This is Remote Ruby.
Have you any remote idea to the meaning of the word?
Hello, Andrew.
What's up, bestie?
Have we talked about your middle name before?
No, and we don't need to.
What is it?
Morgan.
Oh, interesting.
I have a lot of trauma from that middle name.
I don't think it's just the middle name. I was going to say hello, Andrew M, because you go by Andrew M Codes.
Mm-hmm.
And then I was like, oh, that's not his real name. Andrew M Codes. It's Andrew Mason. So, but the M would work just as well.
Yeah, I'm glad we had that discussion. How's your day going?
No, it's been a trip. My wife is out of town at the beach, and I have all 3 kids, which isn't.
Shout out Shannon for the 5-head play here. Going to the beach before a Rails Cop. Dude, that's big brain play right there.
It is. And like watching the kids is draining, but it's not like something foreign to me. But also my dog is sick, and that is foreign to me.
That's sad.
Yeah. We have a door to the backyard in our room. She kept scratching at it every 40 minutes. I need to go to the bathroom. And it was like, I can't be mad at you because you can't help this. But this is the worst. So
yeah. Well,
but
your doggo gets better.
Thank you. She's at the vet right now. But I did get my VR boxing workout in today. So
nice.
I feel like there's some other things to talk about, but we can go ahead and keep talking about them and loop our friend Steve Polito in. Steve, welcome back for your three-peat on Remote Ruby. And if you wouldn't mind, just for anyone who maybe hasn't heard in the other 2 episodes, just a brief intro and hello.
Hey, everyone. Yeah, thanks for having me back on. I would say I'm a community taught Rails developer. I went to college for graphic design, and in college, I briefly got introduced to building websites, but it was through Dreamweaver and tables.
Ah, nice.
Yep. The classic.
That's where I started.
Yeah, slicing up PSDs and then just getting the puzzle piece all together in the table. And then from there, I was able to land a job at an agency, but I was just doing WordPress and Drupal work, but specifically just configuring WordPress and Drupal sites, and then maybe like adjusting the markup and the style sheet. So basically, if there wasn't like a plugin for what I was trying to do, I was in trouble. I didn't actually write any PHP, but that job gave me the opportunity to explore web development, I guess, kind of like at my own pace and fill in the gaps over time. And eventually I learned about Rails. And from there, I was just hooked and just tried to consume as much content as I could to learn how Rails worked, and haven't really looked back since. And just from that, through a series of events, I was able to land my first professional Rails job in 2020. That was at Impact with Colin. And I was there for about 1.5 years, and I applied to Thoughtbot, and happy to say that I got an offer, and I've been working there for the past 6 months.
Rules. There's a lot to unpack there, but we haven't mentioned Chris is out today doing grown-up stuff, doctor's visits and houses. And
I don't know what that's about at all.
Yeah.
I haven't been to the doctor in a long time.
There's never anything you've said that I've believed more.
Are you sure he's not at the mall?
This is it. So we were talking before we started recording about what we're going to talk about, and Steve pulled out literally all the things. So that's why I was ready to talk about basketball, but we had to loop Steve in first because things are coming down to the wire for both the Suns and the Grizzlies right now.
Yeah. I saw that y'all were about to get blown out, and then you didn't.
So by the time this airs, something will have happened. Probably ends up with Golden State moving on and us not. But yeah, we were 3-1 in the series. And so I went to the game Wednesday night. There's an 8:30 tip. Oh, and so at one point, the Grizzlies led by 55 points.
Yeah, I saw that.
So it was fun. We'll see what happens tonight. Now it's 3-2, and it's a little bit, every game is make or break for us.
Right.
So.
And we're tied 3-3 in the series with freaking Dallas. Ugh.
I mean, Dallas is good. I was surprised to see that go 3-3 though.
I was too. All right. All I'm going to say is that there were fans at the game who assaulted Chris Paul's mom and we're just verbally assaulting as well as like
The
physical.
Mother's Day game.
Yeah, dude, are you
I
serious?
read about that.
Shout out people from Texas because I have opinions I'm not going to share.
Oh, Lord. I know plenty of wonderful people in Texas. I have a lot of family there. Yeah. The thing that makes the Grizzlies series interesting is that A, it's been kind of toxic, but B, our star player, John Morant, got injured and he's been out the last 2 games. And so that's why when it moved to 3-1, I can understand why the thought was, oh yeah, this is it. And so that's why it was pretty amazing that there was such a big lead.
Yeah.
That is all I have for basketball today, other than I hope the Grizzlies make it. And if not, then I'll root for the Suns. And if they don't make it,
Right?
but you and I will be watching some basketball next week, whether it's the Suns, Grizzlies, or teams we're rooting against.
Yep.
It'll be good.
We will.
Steve, who's your team?
The New England Celtics.
Yes.
That their name?
Okay. Very familiar with them.
Yeah, they're a new up-and-coming basketball club in the New England area.
You're in or around Boston, right?
Yeah, I'm kind of near Gillette Stadium. I'm like 30 minutes away from Boston, but I'm in the
Are
burbs.
you a Patriots fan?
I'm a nothing. I honestly,
Okay.
If you didn't hear me, I said the New England Celtics, and I'm not even. Is that their name?
No, no.
No, it's the
Yeah,
NEC,
New England
baby.
Celtics, New England Celtics, and Boston Patriots. Those are the teams, right?
That
Yeah.
could work.
What else do we need to cover? Adidas.
I'm going today or tomorrow. Don't worry.
You're not going to wait till we get to Portland?
No.
Have you looked up how close Adidas is? Because I have.
No, I haven't. You always do. Dude, we got to freaking Las Vegas. Oh, no, it was Brittany. We got to Las Vegas when we saw Brittany in the
We were
registration.
waiting in line. Yeah.
And she literally goes, hey, Andrew, you see there's Adidas across the street? No, I didn't look at how close the Adidas was.
That's because you're wearing a band shirt.
I'm sorry.
Is that the,
Adidas shorts.
I saw this woman. She's probably somewhere between 75 and 150 the other day. And she was decked out in Adidas gear. And I was like, that's Andrew's woman.
Yeah.
So
Dude, we could be best friends.
you could. But
Be my new grandma. Yeah, you got nothing to say about that? He had questions. He had
I
a
had-
question. He didn't say it.
there was a lot of things that went through my head.
Your assumption is probably correct, though.
Yeah, I don't doubt it. We covered bet. We've covered basketball. All right. So now that everyone has skipped over this into the more interesting parts because they read the show notes, let's talk some programming, but maybe let's talk more kind of careers around programming. So, Steve, you've been on the show before, like before you had a Rails job, after you had a Rails job, and now you're working at one of the larger names in the Rails industry, just really the tech industry. What was the process like going from Impact to Thoughtbot?
It was a good process. I mean, obviously, I'm biased because I got the job. So, I mean, it went well, but I've interviewed at a lot of other places before, and Thoughtbot's interview process, it's as close to ideal as I can imagine for the types of folks that we're trying to hire. And specifically what I mean by that is, we want to have a diverse group. There's just a lot of benefits to that. And one way, or there's a lot of ways to achieve that, but one way is to, during the interview process, want people to be at their best. So there's no whiteboarding, for example. You're not trying to trick someone. You're trying to replicate real world work as much as possible. And aside from that, you don't need to have a degree, because I don't have a computer science degree. Like I said, I went to school for graphic design, and there's some value in that, obviously, but I didn't have a CS degree. So those things don't matter. But specifically, the things I liked about the interview process, and this is all in the Thoughtbot playbook, which is public. And I can share that after this. So kind of after like a screening call, there's a technical interview, but it's all verbal. And the hiring manager just kind of asks you just how you would build a particular application. You just talk about it. There's no coding at all. And it's great. You're relaxed. You can talk through it very easily. And the hiring manager will just continue to ask more questions, maybe throw some requirements in there, make things a little more challenging. But it's just a conversation, which is great. Again, it's all about trying to be at your best, right? They're not trying to trick you. After that, I thought this was interesting. Right after that particular interview, I had to do code review. And that was just to see not so much how I do code review, but like, how do I interact with a PR? And this was interesting because honestly, I didn't have too much experience with that. You would think so at Impact, but we were such a small team that we, for better or for worse, we didn't do a whole lot of code review. So for anyone listening, I'd recommend practicing that if you can. And I have some advice on how you can do that, because that was a weakness of mine, to be honest. But fortunately for me, I studied before the interview, and Thoughtbot has guides on how to do code review. I would honestly recommend anyone look at that. And that was cool. So I just went through a PR that was open and just added notes. And what's interesting about code review, and I still do this now, is it's not just about finding faults. That doesn't really sound right, but obviously you're trying to scrutinize code to make sure it's up to snuff. But then there's also plenty of times where I'll celebrate something in there. I've learned the most by reviewing other people's code, because I see things in there that I've never been exposed to, and I'll just either ask a question like, hey, what's this? Or, oh, that's neat, I never thought of that before. So I did that, I think, as part of my sample code review, I think, anyways, but it's something I try to do now. So then after that is the final round interview. If things progress well, it just simulates a real day at work. I paired up with 2 different individuals that work at Thoughtbot, and we worked on open issues on our internal, not CRM, but we have like an internal tool just for, it's kind of like Basecamp, just for tracking projects and people. And what was interesting about this is these were real problems. These are real issues that were filed in GitHub. And the people I was pairing with, they didn't study up ahead of time. So again, it's all about trying to replicate real world work and seeing people at their best. So it wasn't as if the person I was paired up with knew the answer to the problem and was trying to see if I could figure it out or not. Because honestly, he didn't even know the answer. We worked towards solving it. It was awesome. I don't want to say it was intense because it was enjoyable, but it was real world work. And there's no better way to simulate that than to do it. So yeah, that was my experience. And obviously it worked out. So yeah, it was very helpful, because that's when the first day came, I was like, oh, what's it going to be like working here? I already knew. And they also know, they were like, well, what's it going to be like to work with Steve? And they knew. So It was good for everyone involved.
That's awesome. The code review thing is very fascinating to me, because that's something we worked in recently in the Podia hiring process. So we give a sample project out, a paid sample project. And then now as part of that, the CTO has like written some CSV import stuff. As part of that, you leave feedback on that pull request, and it's kind of open-ended. Right now, it's just been Jamie, the CTO, and I reviewing these projects, but we're both looking for different things out of the review. And it's not always about the code part of the review, right? Like that's not necessarily the reason we have you do that. It's how do you communicate? It is, what do you find that is fascinating to you about this code or that you would change? And yeah, like I said, it's not always technical. I think that's a really good exercise in hiring. And you make the Thoughtbot process sound like a really good process, kind of not relaxed, but not like intense. But no matter where you're interviewing, I feel like it's always an intense process, right? Just for you personally. And so I think those are kind of a nice way for that person to have some time by themselves to think and show their skills without being on the spot. It's cool.
What did you think about my code review, Jason?
I thought that you were an asshole.
Yep, there it is. There it is. He was not wrong either.
This actually ties back to something Steve said, though, because I remember in yours, you celebrated, hey, this is a good change. I can see your intent here.
Yeah, feedback should always include praise, in my opinion.
I think so as well. And it doesn't have to be like a paragraph of praise. When I'm reviewing PRs, I always try and find something that I'm like, hey, this is great. And even if it's just like I love this, or a ta-da emoji, just something to show like you're doing good. And the more you can do that, I think the easier it is to also deliver the more critical feedback. But yeah, no, I think I remember yours because I remember that. And then when you offer suggestions, and this goes back to that, when you offer suggestions, they don't come across as, oh, wow, they're telling me to do this. It feels more like they just want to help me.
When you're leaving feedback, one thing I like to do, and I don't remember who first said this, but I remember Jamie said it to me recently, or said it recently and I heard him, is that when you're leaving critical feedback, as in like, no, this is wrong and you need to change it, phrasing it as a question is kind of like a really nice way. You get put on the defensive immediately if it looks like someone is critiquing you And so phrasing it as a question is a really nice way to kind of bypass that brain reaction right there and be like, hey, I'm not sure. Maybe what do you think? Is this what you intended? Am I understanding this correctly? What if, have you considered this? Question mark, question mark.
This is really good stuff. And I would love to link to what Steve mentioned, that like Thoughtbot has a thing on how to do this. Because also, like Steve, as you mentioned, when you were on a smaller team, there wasn't a big code review culture. That is just kind of how it is on smaller teams sometimes. Like when I joined Podia, it was like, we would like to do them, but we can't always do them. Yeah, I think encouraging people to practice code review, I don't know, even after the fact. If you're on a smaller team, go review some PRs that have already shipped just for the practice. Most things can be changed.
Andrew, you mentioned a good point about the PR review. And this is in the guide, so I follow the script because it's easy. It's one less thing I have to think about. But if you ever have a recommendation, I always just do, how would you feel about XYZ? And sometimes it's actually like, I don't even know if what I'm suggesting is even correct, but it's still my responsibility to bring it up if I've been asked to review it. This also might sound silly too, but emojis can go a long way. I may not have thought that a few years ago, but there's at least one emoji somewhere in any review I give just to give it a little personality. It kind of removes the ambiguity in there. You never know what someone's thinking, right? And you don't want to come off as maybe being too harsh or something. So that's just like an easy win to do something like that.
I heard this a long time ago, but I've repeated it since because it is true, is that some emojis mean different things to different people. And so that's just one thing to kind of keep in mind. And if you look at the emoji short codes, sometimes the image doesn't actually map to what it is. So like, I don't know, like grimace used to be like foot and mouth. I think
Right.
there's just something to like kind of pay attention to. It's like, hey, this is kind of like ambiguous, or could it be interpreted differently? Or is there a more semantically correct emoji to use here?
That's a good point. I've learned that through hiring more non-US developers. The way we interpret certain emojis are interpreted differently to some of the folks like in Europe, and that kind of stuff's good to be aware of. I stick to ta-da, thumbs up, the man dancing emoji. What else do we use? Rocket. That's a good one. I try to stick to the basics.
Yeah.
What are y'all's basic emojis for a good PR review?
Oh, there's always a good ta-da. I'm definitely a rocket shipper. I'm a big fan of the upside down smiling face. That's like, oh, I forgot to do this upside down smiling face. Big fan of the smile. Sometimes I'll drop a heart in there.
Oh yeah, the heart. The heart is solid.
I'm a purist. I keep it pretty classic. I don't deviate too far from some of the classics. But yeah, rocket ship, when that PR is ready to go, slam the rocket ship button. I do the thinking guy. So
Oh,
for
yeah.
example,
Yeah.
if I say like, hey, what do you think about maybe doing this? I'll throw him in there just to kind of soften the blow. I want to make it feel like we're talking or something, right? So I use that one a lot. Those are my go-tos.
Yeah.
And the ship it. I forgot about ship it.
Yeah, but
Ship
that's
it's good.
That's
That's
only
like
GitHub.
GitHub. Yeah. We have a lot of really good internal emojis at Podia. And I don't.
There's a new one today.
Oh, yeah.
Pedro sent it to me.
What is it?
It's like an image from me from our retreat where I'm like smiling and like waving at the camera. It's like,
That's awesome. I don't want to brag often, but I do
Jason
want to brag.
has so many emojis, dude. Steve, you don't understand how many of our Slack emojis are Jason's face.
But see, I haven't added any of those. The one I am most proud of is the bet emoji.
Oh yeah, that came in clutch.
It's
Widely used now.
very widely used to the point where, like, the other day, probably 80% of the team responded to a general post with bet.
Nice.
Is it time for us to move on from bet?
We're
Is
thought influencer, think influencer.
Have we done our work?
I think we need to change the word, dude.
I was doing my workout the other day and I heard a word that you had taught me. They said this song's a bop.
Yeah.
I liked that. I felt good. The workout.
Bop?
Yeah, I guess so. I've also been using the phrase all my homies hate X.
It's a pretty old meme, but
It's old,
it
but
passes. It's
So
like
was-
the Star Wars. It's an
so
old
was-
code, but it still checks out.
so was bet.
Oh yeah, but people still use bet. Like I see people using it unironically in
Listen.
certain groups.
Bet.
Bet.
But you got to remember, I'm a boomer.
Yeah, that's true.
That 1989 boomer life. Anyway, we've deviated and we will steer the ship back.
Put the train back on the tracks.
Or we got on another ship, so we need to steer the second ship back to the original ship. That's what I meant, obviously. What was the non-technical, technical interview like?
It was very Rails focused because that was the position I was applying for. Yeah, it was basically just like, here's a feature that we're proposing. How would you build it in Rails? And I would just kind of go off and ramble for what felt like an hour. And then there'd be follow-up questions like, sure, that works, but what would happen if we introduced this particular requirement? How would you back out of that or handle that situation? So, I mean, basically, you had to have a good understanding of how Rails works, but you also had to have an understanding of just how to model things, which that's independent of Rails. That's just software. And fortunately, Rails makes those concepts are very easy. I shouldn't say very easy to learn, but like Rails makes that easy to learn versus if you just tried to learn them in isolation, they wouldn't really resonate with me as much. So just by having like built a handful of like hobby projects, I knew enough to be dangerous and kind of answer those questions, which is good. Two other questions too were just like, because again, at Thoughtbot, we're all consultants, so we rotate on and off projects. Just by virtue of that, you're going to be working with different people, working with different software. So then a part of the interview was just like, how do you evaluate risks? How do you bring them up to the client? Things like that, workflow things that have less to do with code, but more to do with just software as a whole. So those skills are very important too.
Hi, my name is Andrew Mason, and I'd like to tell you about Honeybadger. Whether US East 1 is down or you forget to add a configuration file, everyone has an outage from time to time. When your next outage occurs, transparency is critical. The difference between a minor annoyance that people soon forget and a fiasco that creates sustained resentment is how you communicate. That's why you need Honeybadger. Honeybadger is a crucial component of your incident response plan with their uptime monitoring service that now has an exciting new feature, public status pages. Create a new status page with custom domains, branding, and more. Don't let Twitter be the only way your users can find out if your app's down. Sign up for Honeybadger to improve your incident response with a shiny new status page that you'll be proud to show users. Visit honeybadger.io and start giving your users a better experience today. Let them know that Remote Ruby and specifically Andrew Mason sent you.
The Rails architecture tie-in is really interesting. I'm going to tell you something really weird I did yesterday, and I'm just kind of interested on your thoughts about it. Don't worry, it's not too weird. The other day, I was trying to model something out, not in programming at all. It was something completely different. And I'm trying to think about like the hierarchy and the order and what are the attributes of these things that I'm trying to track. And it was hard to keep them all in my head. And I was like, what's the easiest way to do this? And I was like, I should probably pull out some graphing software or whatever. I spun up a Rails app and just started creating models and looking at the schema. And I was like, okay. And at the end of it, I was like, I feel like this is how I want this to be architected. So I'm just kind of interested in like, does Rails, by the nature of the way Rails works, does that kind of help you get better at architecture versus some of the other things out there?
I mean, I can say because I don't have a computer science degree or like a traditional software background, it has helped me a lot. And some of that is Rails and some of that is Ruby because it's written so clearly. So like when you're modeling relationships, a post has many comments. The relationship is built into the language, the way that it's actually written and said, which is great. So I can resonate with what you just said, Andrew. Like I probably would have done something similar. Rails, basically, it just reduces the barrier to entry, in my opinion. It's just so empowering to like run a few scripts and then you have a working MVP. Rails generates scaffold post. You wouldn't necessarily do that in production. But like when I first learned Rails and I saw that script, I was like, this is incredible. This is so cool. And you don't have to worry about all these things that led up to that until you need to worry about them. And there's a balancing act there because if you didn't understand the specifics that were going on, obviously you're going to run into problems. But the way that I learn, I do better if I'm building something. And once I kind of hit a roadblock or a dead end, or I can just tell something's not right, then that's when I do the deep dive into whatever it is that I'm trying to learn. But it's because I can associate like a tangible event to it. So like an example right now is I actually don't know much about service objects. And that's a very general term and concept. But for the longest time, I was just like, why do I need this? I just didn't get it. And I trust people around me that use them. They have more experience. That pattern emerged from somewhere. It's not just because it was an accident, right? Like it emerged over time because that's just an effective way to do things under certain situations. But it didn't mean anything to me. After having worked on the project I'm working on, I understand when and why you would use them. So my advice to anyone listening, trying to either learn Rails for the first time or level up your skills, is find a project that interests you and just try to make a breakable toy, basically. That's what I did to get my first job. I didn't have a resume. It wouldn't have been appropriate to say, I've done all this WordPress stuff. Can you hire me to be a Rails developer? They might say, maybe it'll work out. We'd like to trust you, Steve, but you don't have any Rails experience. So I would just, for better or for worse, buy a handful of domains and kind of force myself to make something real world. And then through that, I would learn these patterns and these pitfalls because I was actually working on something real to the point where I had like a resume of like production applications. And I wouldn't have been able to do that if Rails didn't make it so easy.
To add on to that, it's also really good for debugging, firing up a fresh app when you've run into a bug. Because there's been times I've thought, is there a bug in Rails? Is there a bug in my code? It's usually never a bug in Rails, FYI. It is so easy just to recreate the world. I would also encourage people. The other day, as part of like onboarding at Podia, we do like technical walkthroughs. And I had to do a stimulus one with someone who was new to stimulus. I could try and like set up a JavaScript file with like HTML and teach them, or just fire up a Rails app that has stimulus. So like it's even good for stuff beyond Rails.
It was me. He taught me stimulus.
But
I heard this the other day and I just want to kind of bring it up because it's a good point, is that you did the first episode with us prior to having a Rails job. I was listening to someone talk the other day about hiring, and they were like, one thing we always do is obviously like search the candidate. And they were like, and we came across a podcast episode this candidate did on the subject. And that was actually really informative for us to kind of like hear how they communicated and hear that, oh, they do know this thing, the subject matter and all that stuff. It's an interesting thing that like, because you have a few podcasts with us and wherever else you've gone, that's also an addition to your resume, that you can speak clearly about Rails and talk about Rails, and you have us here and we're all talking about it and you sound really smart and all these other things. So I know not everyone has that opportunity, but it's just kind of something to think about in terms of like bolstering a resume when you have no experience in what you're trying to get a job in.
Yeah, I'm forever grateful to Remote Ruby because that very much helped me. There's no doubt about that. So thank you very much. One thing I can recommend that's more scalable and that people will have more control of is I really think having breakable toys to work on is your best bet into getting your first Rails job if you have no prior experience, because it's a catch-22. Most jobs want experience, but you can't have experience if you don't have a job. So the only way to really do that or fight against that is to just organically create your own experience through breakable toys, hobby projects, etc. And then also from that, take things from that and make them into blog posts or tweets or screenshots. They could be questions. They don't even have to be fully polished pieces. They could be very simple. And if you just start consistently doing that week after week, month after month, it also helps you stand out when you apply for your first job because you can point someone to your website or your GitHub profile and they can just see hopefully a paper trail of things that you've been learning. And again, like they don't have to be these really verbose, in-depth, original thoughts. They could just be like interesting, today I learned pieces. Because honestly, that's what I do still now. And like, I don't know, half the things I'm posting, they're not necessarily original. It's not this groundbreaking thing, but I happen to find it interesting that particular day because I stumbled upon it. And I figure like, well, maybe someone else would find this interesting. It's a great way to get feedback too, because there's no better way to get the right answer than putting out.
Yes.
Like, and I'm not even doing that on purpose. It's not like I'm trying to put something out there that's incorrect. It's just, that might be where I landed for that day. And I'm like, yeah, this work. And then someone will be like, that's cool, but you can do it this way. And then it's like, that's sweet. I just learned something. It's great. It's a great feedback loop. And then again, you can take that to, it's basically a resume at the end of the day, or like a part of it. So I would really encourage people to do that as much as possible.
That's something I wanted to talk to you about because it's something I've always noticed you've done, like even back from the first episode, is you were very open about, and you have screenshots of code saying like, this is something I learned today, or this is something I'm trying. And the one that comes to mind recently is when you were like, I want to build authentication generator from scratch. That wasn't that recent, I guess. It was like 6 months. It was a generator, right?
Yeah. I wanted to learn how to do it. And then at the end of the day, I wanted to take all of that and package it up in a generator to kind of be a companion to the guide. Because once the guide the guide, I guess, it's evolving, right? But then so can the generator. And then after you read the guide, again, it's a companion. That's the idea. Once you kind of read through the guide and get a sense of how authentication works with Rails, it would be kind of a pain to have to go to the guide, copy the code blocks. So I was like, it's just like, the logical step here is make this into a generator, which that was fun too, because I've never done that before. But through the power of open source, I just looked at the Notice gem and saw how that was built. More so how it was tested, because I wanted to make sure the files generated were going to work. And that was a lot of fun. And again, I got a lot of helpful feedback on there. Some people pointed out some security flaws, and I appreciate that. And then because I'm actively working on it, again, it kind of goes back to having like a hobby project to work on. It really resonated with me, and I'm not going to forget it. Versus if I just read an article about security, I wouldn't have any place to kind of store that information. It wouldn't have any sticky factor. But now I'm like, oh, I understand exactly why this is a problem.
Yep. It's important to make connections between objects in your brain, because your brain is not a remembering device. It is a object mapper. It makes connections. It's not good at remembering or storing information.
Yeah, I love that. I still remember seeing people respond to you on Twitter talking about the things like, hey, this is something that might be considered insecure. That was fun for me. Obviously, it's a pain in everyone else's ass now, but like, I love talking about authentication. And so like seeing you just like put yourself out there, like, I want to learn this. I was like, this is cool. I like this.
I appreciate that. And again, it's the quickest way to get the right answer too, in some regard. It's like nerd sniping, right? Some people are like, aha, did you think about this though? And I'm like, I didn't, but I knew that this was going to attract a lot of feedback, which is great. And the whole reason I did that too is because authentication really intimidates me. Not so much anymore, but it's still a lot to learn. Because originally I did Michael Hartle's Rails tutorial book, and that was like instrumental in me at least learning enough. Well, as the title says, learning enough to be dangerous. But the whole authentication part, when I first read it, I was like, I trust him, but I don't know what's going on here. And everyone defaults to Devise. I think that's a good thing. Like Devise is mature. It's very secure. It's always up to date. But I also there were two motivating factors. One, I just wanted to learn how authentication really works so I could understand it. But also there was a part of me that was a little concerned about just having to depend on another gem for authentication. And I was just thinking about, because I think that for a while there was an issue where it just wasn't really compatible with Rails 7. And that's no one's fault. It's just how open source works. Like, it's free. So you can't expect someone to be constantly maintaining it and doing all these things. But I just kind of wanted to not be dependent on something, especially because basically Rails gives you the tools you need to make authentication. The real challenging part is coming up with your workflow. Do you have to require someone to validate their email address? How do you handle password resets? But like, Rails gives you all the tools to do this. And there's times where if you use Devise, obviously it works very well, but you can paint yourself into a corner where you're like, oh, you know what? I kind of wish my authentication flow was like this, but I can't do that. It would be too difficult to configure Devise to do it another way. And if you know how to roll your own authentication, you wouldn't be in that situation. But it's all trade-offs though.
I want to highlight something you just said real quickly, because I've been seeing this play out in real time in a really damaging way. Is please, for the love of God, make your users confirm their email address if they input it on your sign-up form. Because Reddit didn't used to do that, which, I mean, you could just use your imagination how that's a disaster. I'm literally watching this play out in real time where there's a Reddit account. It's obviously not tied to this person who it was basically representing, because it was using their email and it was doing really bad stuff, to the point where like it became like this big issue that I'm not going to get into, but it became like a really bad problem for a group of people because of that. So just please do it.
I will.
Thank you. We kind of segued here on our own, but I was going to mention your Twitter presence, because you are one of my favorite people to follow on Twitter, because you actually post interesting and useful tidbits. I've been purging my Twitter recently of things and people, and I'm like, Nope, Steve stays because Steve has really good content and I really enjoy following him. And so I'm just kind of curious how your presence on Twitter may have, I mean, it doesn't have to be Twitter. It could be some other social media platform, but you in this instance use Twitter. So what about Twitter, or you think your presence there and the type of content you post, how has that helped you? Or maybe it has.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you. Overall, I think it's helped me, at least maybe in the tech industry. I'm probably oversimplifying, generalizing here, but I think the tech industry leans towards Twitter more versus maybe marketing might lean towards LinkedIn more. Like that's where all the marketers hang out.
I can actually, statistically on Twitter, it is sports, news, and tech. Those are the three biggest areas, like confirmed. So yeah, you are correct.
Okay. So I think it's just valuable if you're in tech, if you're sharing the things you know, chances are a hiring manager or someone along the line is going to look at your Twitter account if you have one. And if you're consistently posting things that interest you about tech, they'll get a good sense of like how you think, how you communicate, how you code. It kind of creates a sense that they basically have a sense of who you are as a programmer without even having to have met you, which is good because a lot of programming is just you're communicating all day through code. So if folks can kind of get a glance into what you're doing and how you're coding, that just makes it, I'm guessing it makes it easier for them to decide if they want to hire you or network with you, etc. For me, it's been good. And you had Seb on a few weeks ago. He's a big inspiration to me. He does the same thing. He does it very well. He's just always sharing things that he's learned. And honestly, he's someone that inspired me, just like his format, the way he takes the time to make a nice image of the code block. So I owe a lot to him too.
Yeah, Seb is not only fantastic at Twitter, but fantastic to chat with and work with.
Seb is awesome.
So like, do you consider yourself kind of naturally open to feedback? Because one of the things I guess that's kept me from like wanting to be open and share things I know on Twitter is like just a fear of looking like an idiot or like people being like, no, you're wrong, you're wrong. Is that something you struggle with? How do you manage that?
I do not have an issue with it for talking about code samples because it's removed from who you are as a person, in my opinion, right? You're sharing code. Obviously, there's a connection between the person who wrote it and everything, right? Like you don't want someone to say, hey, this is terrible. You stink at programming. But it's not like you're sharing something like personal about yourself or you're not at risk of having like your actual person offended, right? So for me, it's not a big deal. And we have a dev channel at Thoughtbot and I'm constantly in there just either asking questions or sharing things too. And half the time it's either wrong or incomplete. But I love it because the thing is like, I'm getting paid to learn. I don't care. Like that's kind of the mindset I have. It's not like, okay, don't deduct wrong answers out of my paycheck. Maybe I should check. Hopefully they don't. I haven't checked in a while, but that's the best way to learn is to just ask questions, especially again, like if you're wrong too, like you'll probably get an answer quicker. I haven't had an issue with that personally, but I've accrued enough knowledge that I at least have like a good enough foundation where I can pose a question.
Right.
But I wouldn't want to discourage anyone from ever asking any question because chances are someone else probably has that question too and they might be too afraid to ask.
Like I'm more than comfortable asking at work sounding like an idiot. I guess there's just something about like that publicness of Twitter that's like, I don't know. It's interesting.
I'll teach you. Because I feel like maybe the reason, because I'm the exact same way as you, Steve. I don't care if you think I'm an idiot or not, because at the end of the day, if I don't know the question, I'm trying to find the answer, right? So I don't care. I'm not worried about sounding like an idiot. I don't care because at the end of the day, I think I'm a moron. So just drop your self-esteem, people, and then you'll get there.
Yeah. I mean, it probably is something deeper in myself that I should work on. That's actually really not about Twitter or code. But anyway, we are out of time today, but I feel like we should have a part 2. Because
I feel like we should too.
I mean, obviously, without Chris here, Andrew and I just do whatever the hell we want. There's so many things we did want to talk about, at least I did, around transitioning from your last job into a consulting style job and things like that I think would be really fascinating. So if you have the ability, let's pick this up next week, or we'll be at RailsConf for the week after.
We'll be at RailsConf next week. So you mean the week after that or something?
You got to fly out. Got to get my ticket.
Yep.
Hey.
Come on to RailsConf. But yeah, no.
Just to the podcast in a hotel room.
Just podcast, leave.
If everybody's good with that, let's do that because there's still a lot to discuss.
Let's do it.
Yeah.
Then Steve can be our number one most repeated guest of all time. And
Yeah.
send him a gold star.
Is 4Pete a thing?
4-Pete, the quad threat.
It's going to be now, I guess. Yeah, this is pretty cool. This is a high honor. And I don't say that lightly. This is very cool.
Like Andrew said earlier, like, I enjoy listening to you speak. I have a lot more I'd like to hear from you. So, yeah, we'll pick it up next time. And until then, we'll see you.
Go Suns.
Go Grizz.
Don't put that in, Paul.
Paul, put that in. Put that in.
Put that in, Paul. Don't put that in.